This is I Should Be Writing Season 21, Episode 10, I think. You know, I always think I should have like I Should Be Writing bingo card, and one of them is definitely Mer forgets which episode this is. Mer messes up her numbering. But anyway.
Well, I should be writing. I should be working on my craft. I should be writing. I should be submitting my next draft, but I'm sitting home watching Doctor Who.
Hi there, welcome to I Should Be Writing. This is a podcast for wannabe fiction writers, and I am your host, Mer Lafferty. We stream live on Twitch Thursday afternoons at 3 p.m. Eastern, and then it goes into the podcast sphere, whatever that is. And I've been podcasting for 20 years and writing professionally for, I guess 11 or 12. Wow. Did not expect that. Anyway, that's my credentials, why I'm sitting here talking about writing. If you take writing advice from the internet, make sure you're listening to somebody who's actually doing it. But I'm delighted to welcome K.M. Huber, author of The Call of the Owl Woman. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I'm a day out of pub dates, so I'm still in that transition period from who is she to all of a sudden I'm an author.
Yeah. I think you were an author before it came out because you had to write it and do all those many steps to publishing, right?
Get validated.
Yes. That is my job. That is literally my job here, is to validate anybody who doesn't think they're a writer. That if you're putting words down, you're a writer. Are you?
Well, I call myself a writer.
Oh, good.
Yeah, it's the author part that feels like it has to be somehow out in the world.
What is the difference?
The out in the world part, in my head. In my head, anyway. Yeah.
Okay.
Because I've been a writer for a long time.
Well, let's hear about that. You, your website says you've got one foot in Tennessee and the other one in Peru. And since this is a historical fantasy based on Peru, can you tell me a little bit about yourself and that the path that led you to writing this book with one foot in Tennessee and one foot in Peru?
One foot in Peru. Yes, my husband is from Peru. And we were living in New York when we started our family and just wanted to have our kids start out bilingually. So we made the big move to Peru. He hadn't been back there to live since he left for college and then had lived and worked overseas. So we dove back into Peru. I had been there to visit, and it's magical. There's just so many incredible histories and landscapes and geographies, and you know, I was able to go to Machu Picchu before it was overrun and regulated, and
oh wow!
And there was still a little tourist hotel up at the top that if you booked it months in advance, you could get in for like a hostel price. So wow. That was back in 1978, my first trip to Peru, and it was magical and mystical, and we were up on the mountain. Sun rose and the fog was lifting and all the llamas and alpacas were roaming around, and there were only 20 people on the mountain instead of a giant hotel or all the people who come off the trains. You know, they go home at 4:30 and then you have the place to yourself. So I was really, really spoiled by having that kind of magical environment and the mountains and the hummingbirds and the orchids all around. So that was my first sort of hook into Peru, and then wanting to know more about the history and spending a lot of time traveling. And it became my second home. I lived there for over 20 years off and on. But when we first got there, it was in the middle of like this incredible social and civil conflict and bombs going off everywhere. And, you know, kind of getting a piece, a view of the world from not the safe environment that I had grown up in.
Yeah.
And kind of becoming more aware of the realities of a lot of different places in the world. So anyway, to make a long story short, I was working on a project, and my daughter was a teenager at the time and said, "Can't you do your next project as something that a teenager would want to read, and something about my native country because she was born there?" Mm-hmm. And, we were also exploring ancient cultures. At the time, she wanted to be an archaeologist who discovers a new planet and an ancient civilization. And so, to kind of feed all of those interests that we sort of shared, we picked our favorite culture at the time, which was the Nazca, mm-hmm. and, with a lot of mysteries to answer and look into. And then on a cross-country trip one day when we were in the States and the boys and her father were all at other summer obligations or work obligations, we drove across country in the across Lake Superior and then down to Atlanta, and outlined this book that would be fun to write and fun to read. And it became a whole lot bigger project as we moved back to Peru, and I dove into the research and fell in love with not only the culture, but the questions. And I think it was exploring the questions that was the most interesting part of the process. And it was my way also to kind of give something back to my second country and to highlight one of the cultures that not many people know about outside of Peru. And so that's kind of the background for why this book.
Although I hate this question because you gave us the point in time of your daughter asking for this book, how long between her asking for it and last Tuesday has it been?
Way too long. There were a lot of detours along the way. So she has now just had her first baby, and it's like almost 20 years later.
Congratulations.
Yeah. So, and a lot of things that I worked on along the way, or that I detoured from, and a lot of moves and different things. So it hasn't been a constant time, but it has taken that long for it to find this particular iteration. I mean, it was published in Peru in Spanish during the pandemic. We used that time to translate it and into Spanish. And that was also an interesting process. So it's interesting because here it's like having it come out in English in my home country feels very different than having it come out in Peru, I guess, where it's interesting because when you asked me and I felt, like the validation of being an author, I felt that when I was in Peru, but somehow I didn't quite translate when we moved back to the States as feeling like, yes, I'm there, but it's Peru is kind of far from the U.S. public's awareness in general.
Yeah. So let's talk about Call of the Owl Woman. What can you tell us about it?
Oh, it's really a young girl's journey into becoming a young woman and stepping into her own destiny and struggling with what people expect of her and what she wants, but also at a time when things are falling apart in the world around her, environmentally, socially. And I picked that time on purpose because it was right before the Nazca culture disappears. And some of the questions are, how does a culture that thrives for almost 1,000 years suddenly disappear from the region? And then there's not really any sign of major development for another 100 or so years when the Wadi civilization from the mountains moves down to the coast and then starts a new empire. But just those questions, bigger picture, civilization, humanity, the kinds of things that I think you also ask in science fiction in the future. It's like, sometimes I think it's very similar. The speculation about what happens in societies and cultures and going into the past with no written language is in some ways, without the technology, a similar process to trying to imagine how people deal with crises, how people deal with resources, all that kind of stuff. And then making that real in a particular character, in a particular family, in a particular place.
So this is technically YA. You wrote it for your daughter from 20 years ago. This is your first book, right?
This is my first published
book. Have you always wanted to write in the YA genre, or whatever we called it, in the past couple of decades, but for that audience, or did you have to approach it in a new way, kind of new to you kind of way?
In a way, it was new to me, thinking how much, at the sake of thinking of the audience, but also at the same time thinking, when I read Madeleine L'Engle's Wrinkle in Time, that was very much, a middle grade kind of book. Yeah. But she didn't write for middle graders. She wrote what she needed to write and what she wanted, the stories that she wanted to tell. And she would say, and that was before they talked about YA as a category.
Yeah.
So she said, I want, everyone to read it. These are stories that I think are relevant to all people. And I kind of feel that way. I feel like the book, even though the protagonist is a 15-year-old girl, I think the issues are still relevant. I think the feelings are still relevant. So I kind of hope it will be a sort of crossover, that it will fit, but not. And I guess recently also young A. I know more adults that love to read young A, young A, YA. Mm-hmm. Than some of the mainstream stuff that's in adult fiction. Yeah. So I think there's the distinction is sort of almost arbitrary. I mean, I'm more aware of like not wanting to go too deep into certain things that might be triggering or traumatic, or like we were talking about earlier, language, mm-hmm. The kinds of things that just to be a little bit more sensitive about that, and to also highlight the feelings that a teenager is going through in terms of identity and those emotions that somehow we always think the adults could never have understood. Mm-hmm. Because when we're going through it, it's like, this is our world. I mean, I grew up in the era where anybody over 30 you couldn't trust. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. That I'm working on another novel that is now more geared towards middle grade. Mm-hmm. I'm working on several projects, but the middle grade one kind of came out of my saying, what did I want to read at that age that wasn't that I could sort of tap my own eager opening into the world and discovery. What changed my perspective in a lot of things was Madeleine L'Engle's stuff. 6th grade, my whole world opened.
Me too.
I was like, oh, I didn't know those things were possible. And this is a protagonist that is, not the popular kid in the high school lunchroom, but the one who's really thinking about things and struggling with things. So,
what a lot of people say, attribute to like Lord of the Rings. Mm-hmm. When they read it as a child or as a teen and it just blew their mind, that was Wrinkle in Time for me. So yes, mm-hmm. I fully understand.
And I read the Lord of the Rings, but there was something much more accessible for me about Meg. Mm-hmm. It's like I felt like there was it was when you see yourself reflected in something that's a little less than fantasy. I mean, it's still fantasy, but she was also going into space, and she was doing all these things, and she was thinking about science, and she was still a good big sister, and mm-hmm. she was also, able to have a romantic relationship sort of that starts out as just a buddy friendship sort of thing, and all those things that were just kind of, sparkly for a 6th grader, an 11-year-old,
Yeah.
And the science, and I feel like sometimes that book keeps coming back to mind, even in our contemporary times, as I think about questions of evil versus good. At the time it felt like kind of simplistic, but I feel like we're kind of there now again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so
definitely. I want to talk a little bit about your publishing journey because, we have a lot of beginning writers or early career writers who listen to this podcast, and I like to ask about your publishing journey and also what kind of things you ran up against that was frustrating or you thought would beat you because, clearly it didn't because your book is out. So
rejection letters and
yeah, exactly. So how was that experience for you?
Well, for me, I've always written. I used to write poetry, and that as a teenager, and then I got disgusted with my own poetry because I thought it was trite or it was too rhymey, and that was not, I wanted to break out like that into a more cool sort of whatever. And so I burned it all. And then 10 years later, wished I hadn't, because I still remember some of those, verses in my head that still capture things that I had gotten very judgmental about. I didn't major in English in college because I felt like it was too cliquey. There was something about it, or the over-analyzing of things. Mm-hmm. It's like I wanted to enjoy writing. I didn't want to be tearing it apart, which is what I felt was happening in a lot of the literary classes. So I did theater, where it was like bringing it to life, or playwriting and reading theater. Didn't feel quite as critical. It was more about how do you bring things to life in different forms. But I continued to write and keep journals, and moved to New York because I had spent a semester in New York during college and unexpectedly fell in love with the city. I mean, I grew up just north of Seattle. I love my mountains and trees and water and friendly people on the streets. When I first moved to New York, I used to say hello to everybody I passed. That didn't last too long. By the time my sister came to visit, I was cursing at people who bumped into me on purpose, So, but I love New York, and I just didn't want to raise a family there. It was just too expensive and too chaotic, and I didn't have enough. There were wonderful parks, but it just wasn't quite where we wanted to raise our kids. But when I stopped and slowed down, I was collecting stories too. I studied social work. I ended up going into social work. And I was the only one who enjoyed writing process. When we had to, as a student and an intern, when you're first going out, you have to write anything up, and so you can go over it with your supervisor. So it was great to be writing all these stories and these interactions with people and their struggles and what they were dealing with. And I kept those boxes of files because I was sure someday those people would come into stories that I was going to tell. But it was like I ended up collecting more material. And I also had people, the classic, oh, you can't write, you haven't suffered enough, or you can't write, you haven't, or you shouldn't be writing, you should be out there living, or you shouldn't, all of those kinds of things. So, being able to call oneself a writer, even when you feel it, I felt was always a struggle. I mean, in 8th grade, I had a teacher say, you haven't suffered enough. And I thought, who the blank are you to know what I have experienced, And the worst thing was, he was my favorite teacher. I kind of had a crush on him. And when he just kind of laughed it off when I said, I want to be a writer. I said, oh, you haven't suffered enough. He says, I wanted to say, have you been in my home? Have you lived through what I've lived through? Do you know what I think and feel, beyond what you see in this classroom?
Yeah.
But it stuck. It stuck with that. You can't do it. And I think a lot of writers I talk to have this also internalized critic that says, you're not good enough, or you haven't done this enough, or you haven't experienced that enough, or you can't translate it well enough. So yeah, that's one of the big things that we talk about, and I've got a writing group that I'm still connected to in Lima. And we call ourselves the Tertulia, because we get together and we get off track and we talk about a lot of other things also.
Yeah.
But one of them has just debuted her 2 children's books. I'll just give a shout out to Sarah Fajardo, because she's doing wonderful work and is also Peruvian American. And we share, great love for the cultures, especially in the mountains of Peru. The things that have been kept alive even through the Spanish conquest and the violence of the years and this resilience of still holding a relationship to the earth in some of the, especially Andean cultures, that just feels like something to highlight and bring forth a lot more. But we talk a lot about the imposter syndrome, it's like, or what it takes to feel like you're worthy. And I've, started getting more reviews and that kind of stuff. And part of me is like, don't let my ego get involved. I just write what I need to write and it's okay. But then you look for that validation, for people who are getting what you're trying to do. But the people who don't, and, it's no book is going to make everybody happy.
No.
And nobody wants, there's so many tastes and so subjective. And they're telling you that from the beginning when you go into the slush piles and you're trying to write. You were asking about the journey. I was trying to send things from Peru the first time I was there. I thought I had great stories, but I had no idea that you had a special formatting for submitting things. So I would just send things off to magazines, Oh, no. And since postage was so expensive, and that was a time when, you type with carbon paper if you wanted to keep a copy of something. And I would send things off single-spaced with narrow margins so that I could use less paper.
Yeah.
It wouldn't cost so much to send things out. Until finally somebody wrote back and said, we really prefer to see things in standard formatting, which is, and I'm like, oh, how embarrassing. But I didn't know this. But, there's so much accessible now, resources for finding things online, et cetera. But I hadn't taken writing courses and I hadn't done any of that. And I just felt kind of and I loved ellipses, I loved long pauses on the page. Someone wrote back, 3 dots is all you need for an ellipse. Please don't
you were just stringing them along.
Yeah. It's like, I especially in poetry in particular, I would want to hold that space.
I don't know. I can see it in poetry because you try to convey different things with poetry, and therefore E. Cummings with the no capital letters and all that. So it's I don't know. I'd buy the really long ellipses. I would buy it.
I loved E. Cummings, and I had an aunt who got really upset when I wrote my letters all in lowercase. And I would not capitalize my I's because I said that's too egocentric. Why don't I? It's okay just to use a smaller case. And she says, no, I was an English teacher for 20 years. Please, when you write to me, do it correctly. So, yeah. And then you have in our writers group in Peru, we have a German American Peruvian who's so prolific in her poetry, Rose Bohm, that the rest of us sort of sometimes feel like, why can't we produce as much as quickly? And like everybody has their own rhythm, and her gems come out but she's also, really didn't get started until she was, her poetry part, which she's just been churning out book after book. But she'll stop and point out, I didn't really start this part of my life until later after my career and doing other things. And now I'm really focusing on that. So it's like everyone has their time. But you don't get your time if you don't keep at the work. Right. If you don't keep trying, it's like you can't get accepted someplace you don't submit. Exactly. So I just kept throwing them out there and thought I should use this paper when you would get paper rejection slips. Should use it to wallpaper something, make it useful.
The looking online for validation just scares the heck out of me because I don't want to read any review. My ego is so fragile that if a review said 9 great things and one thing I had to work on, I would remember that one thing and just be depressed for the rest of the day. And
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I love it when people who send rejection letters actually add something that's sort of helpful or inspiring. And one of the ones I got actually included several examples of rejections of famous books. And one in particular stuck with me that said, it was a letter to F. Scott Fitzgerald saying, if you could just get rid of the Gatsby character, that might be a good book. So I've held on to that one. It's like, it's all subjective.
Yeah. Yeah. And, the more popular you are, the more people you're going to find that don't like your books just because of math, So it's you just got to learn either to get tough skin or not to seek that information online, which is what I do. It may not be the healthiest thing, but it works. So when you talking about the person in your head that beats you up, I call that the bullies, and I've recognized at least 7, maybe 8 of them. I think the imposter police is going to have to be one of them. But there's things like the person who tells you you're garbage, the person who tells you that someone else is better than you. It's kind of an envy focus to it. And then there's the sponge, which has been getting me lately. It's like, oh, I can do that. I'll write. But after I clean this thing, it's been, even as I know it, I'm pinning it on. On one of my notebooks around here, I have the sponge has gotten me today. And still, it's really.
But the bathroom's clean.
The bathroom's clean. Exactly. What do you think? What are you still afraid of, or what holds you back today as a writer?
That's still there a little bit. But because I know there's definitely things that hold me back. And part of it is maybe that feeling of being exposed. It's like, how deep do I go in some of the things that I share? And who is going to think that they recognize themselves in something that I've created that does not necessarily have anything to do with them, even though they might have flavored it. It's not really them. And I remember reading Thomas Wolfe having trouble going back to Asheville after he became a famous author, and having people saying, how dare you write that scene about me? And he was like, that wasn't really about you.
Yeah, why would you, if it wasn't written about that person, why would they see themselves in this negative light? So, yeah.
Or it's something they're carrying that they maybe think, oh my goodness, you saw that and you picked up on it and you exposed me, when it was like, no, that's just your projection on that particular thing. Of course, he also did write a lot about people that he knew that everybody knew was them. But what struck me in his writing was the ones that really bothered him were the ones that got really angry about something that really didn't have anything to do with them.
Yeah, but then once he made it big, they were delighted to have him and claim him as their own.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe that's a piece.
Yeah, or sure my hometown would do. I don't know if my hometown would pay attention to the fact that I was a writer, because they haven't yet. So.
What's your hometown?
Banner Elk, North Carolina. In the mountains about 8 miles away from the Tennessee border.
Is that near Burnsville?
Somewhat. I've never been to Burnsville, but I know I knew somebody from there who went to college in the town. But yeah, it's a tiny little town connected to ski resorts. So, yeah.
Beautiful mountains. Got pretty slammed by Helene.
Yes, they were.
Talk about, seeing climate changing. All these Californians who moved to North Carolina, Western North Carolina, to avoid the fires, and then suddenly get slammed with floods in places that don't usually get flooded. So
let's go back to your book and talk to me a little bit about the mythology. I'm curious how you chose your what part of the story to make. It's a historical fantasy, so there is fantastical elements involved. And I also want to know if you had any pushback, because I know a lot of people, either if they're non-white or they're trying to present a non-European fantasy story that they get pushback of, well, no one will relate to this kind of thing. So, well, I think it's super exciting to see a mythology presented that I don't know anything about. That's, I've heard publishers can be crappy about that. So what have you experienced?
And reviewers, yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah. In general, there hasn't been. I was surprised. I sort of expected more, but I spent a lot of time there. I spent a lot of time researching. No one else is writing about it, so, and this is like long past era, that a lot of Peruvians actually thank me for writing it, because, and one interview that I had in Lima a couple of years ago, she was saying, how is it that we're not writing these stories about our own past? I'm, really grateful that you have done this and doing it with such respect that it's very emotional. And part of me felt like publishing it in Peru first was my way of also saying, ideally, I think I would have liked to have had it come out in both in English and Spanish at the same time, but there was a small publisher in Peru who was interested. And my priority was to have it in Peru first, because I also felt like if it's welcome here, people outside can't complain that I am overstepping my bounds as a white woman in writing about an indigenous ancient culture, when sometimes I also think we get to the point of extreme protectiveness when we should be honoring those things that our ancestors have done, and maybe we are all connected anyway. I mean, it's like if you believe in past lives, you might have been part of an ancient culture, and our molecules and atoms have been part of different places in the universe, and we're all stardust, So why not honor those pieces of our general culture? It's that fine line between appropriation and appreciation.
Yeah.
I'm not saying I remember I think I was querying my book when the big kerfuffle about was it the American Dirt came out, and that just was like blew up so much. But I felt like so much of it was that the publishing industry was falsely representing it. And maybe she was, and I know that there were some issues that she probably would have benefited from talking to more authenticity readers or something. But I don't think it would have happened like that, because she actually wrote about wanting to honor certain things. But there were so many books that were written by people who had experienced what she was writing about that were not acknowledged by publishers and were not picked up, that I think that's where the real damage was, in not acknowledging own voices where they are and elevating someone else's. Right? And it probably wouldn't happen so much if they hadn't tried to make it, this is the Mexican immigration novel. It's like, no, that's not what it is. It stands on its own as a romantic thriller adventure, perhaps, but not what the publishers were trying to call it. And so I know they did a lot of backpedaling on that one. And I've seen other books that were killed before they even came out because someone saw an advanced reader copy and said, can't have somebody writing about a culture they're not part of. And then that kind of, if no one's writing about it, then you're condemning it to never being celebrated or understood or explored.
Right.
So yeah, that's a question that comes up. And but it hasn't. So far, the reviews that have started out by saying, I was really suspicious, of seeing this white woman write about, came backed off and said, oh, I understood after I read the whole thing and read the acknowledgments and appreciated the research that went into it and the care that was taken. So I think if we're honoring what we're writing about and not trying to, I'm rambling now.
No, you're fine. So we were talking about being a writer versus an author, and I had a realization. I don't ask this to a lot of people, but I think I should start. What does success mean to you?
That's a question I ask myself a lot, actually. Because, when I look at my trajectory, I was getting some stories published. I was getting some poems published in obscure literary magazines, through the old, pre-digital route of sending things out. And it felt really good to have my work in hand in a physical copy. I still really, that meant a lot. My first paid thing was a poem I got paid $50 for, and I thought, wow, I went out and bought a scarf to celebrate,
nice.
Special. And then I didn't get paid for anything else for years and years and years, but I thought at that moment, oh, I've made it. I've been recognized. Somebody actually wants to pay for my work.
Yeah.
But I think being able to share for stories to reach people who need or want or resonate with the story can be such a healing process. That's kind of what I want. If just a few people really connect and say, I needed this book and I needed it right now, it was just what what helped me get through something, then that's worth, I guess, a lot more than that to me is success. It's not but the sales numbers become the external validation, that people look for. It's like, and that I struggle with, because I really don't want to get into marketing. I don't. Yeah. It sort of erodes my spirit, and yet I have fun when I'm in places where I'm connecting with people and talking about writing and worlds and other worlds and that kind of stuff. So trying to find also that balance. I think success for me would be having enough time to write what I want to write, when I want to write it, and when I need to write it, and not having to worry about the business side of things or whether or not there's an income coming in. And, so in that sense, I feel very privileged that I'm actually retired and have gotten to a place of enough financial security that that's not what's driving me. Mm-hmm. But I really sympathize with people who are trying to make a living at writing, because especially now, how many millions of books are coming out, just pouring out in the last few decades. It's like exponentially increased, and access, through digital access, there's just so many more books. I used to complain before digital access that I didn't have enough time to read the books I wanted to read. Too many books, too little time, and my to read stack keeps getting higher and higher, and my time is not. So,
right.
I think it's really challenging for anyone who's writing. So just knowing that your story might reach someone that it needs to reach is to me enough reason to put the energy and time into writing something that you feel called to write.
That's awesome. What advice would you give to beginning writers?
The stuff that has kept me going is to keep going, is to just not worry about the external validation while you have something to say. If you feel you have something to say, just put the time into saying it. You don't know when it might actually come to pass. I'm hoping actually that the first novel I wrote may actually find its day still, because when I was querying that one, everyone was like, "Oh, nobody's going to want to read about people in a retirement home. Come on, there's no market for that." And that was like across the board, there's no market for this. And in recent decades, there's definitely been a market for stories with older protagonists,
especially in the murder mystery genre.
Right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, don't. And how many people have written or artists have produced and not been recognized in their time, but come to be very significant later. So it's like if you have something you feel you have to share or to give or to contribute or to just have fun with, somebody else may find it later, and just trust that it will find its way to someone somewhere sometime, and not obsess about when, where, or how.
That's great. Thank you. Where can we find you online?
kmhuber.com is my website. I'm not real good at keeping it up, but I'm trying to put stuff up there. And one of the things that I've learned in this process of sending out advance copies and getting feedback with how difficult it is to be flipping back and forth between names, because the names are complicated. But I thought I should do. If it were an audiobook, it would have a PDF. Why don't I just do a PDF, put it up on my website, and I'll even add pronunciations, because that's also frustrating for people, because they want to talk about it, but then they're like, how do I pronounce this name? And I'm like, okay, I've been seeing it so often, I don't even think twice. But yeah, so I'm going to upload a PDF with the glossary, the cast of characters, and pronunciation guide.
That's a great idea. I love that.
And that way you can print it out and you don't have to flip. You can just have it on the side of the book. Yeah. And the map. Yeah.
Yes, I was just thinking that with the map, because I just finished an ebook and I kept thinking, I want to look at the map, but there's no good UI for ebooks that I've found, and I didn't want to go through the rigmarole of going back to page 1 to look at the map. So
exactly.
It's just a pain. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you being on the show. If y'all want to get in touch with me to ask a question about writing or anything, you can contact mightymur@gmail.com, and my blog and show notes will be at murverse.com. It is Escape Pod's 20th anniversary this week, and Valerie Valdez and I have a very special story coming out. Very excited for it. It's hysterical, trust me. But yeah, that's escapepod.org. And you can find my books at most bookstores. So I write about currently space murder. So that's me. Thank you so much, Kathy. And everybody go out and get The Call of the Owl Woman. And oh yeah, you guys should be writing. Thank you for listening to I Should Be Writing, the longest running writing podcast in existence. This episode was made possible by the Fabulous, who support the podcast via Patreon or Substack. Join the Fabulous at patreon.com/mightymur or mightymur.substack.com. Theme music provided by John Anelio, art provided by Numbers Ninja, and podcast hosting provided by Libsyn. This episode is released under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 license. You can find all of my books and podcasts at murverse.com.
Doctor Who.